Well, anyway, last week we talked about the story of the Buddha leading up to his enlightenment. And after his enlightenment, he started wondering whether he should try to teach what he had discovered, because he wasn't sure that people would get it. He said, "This is really deep stuff, and I don't know what to do." So he was sitting by the shore of the river one day, and he noticed the lotuses that were growing there. And some of them stayed mired down in the mud. And some of them rose up to the surface of the water but didn't go any higher. And some of them rose completely up out of the mud, out of the water, and bloomed with nothing touching them. And he said, people are the same way. Some of them can hear the Dharma and they'll stay stuck in the mud. Some of them can hear the Dharma and they'll rise, make some spiritual progress. And some of them, after hearing the Dharma, will become completely enlightened. So during his 6 years of asceticism, much of that time he had been accompanied by these 5 ascetics who had seen his determination, and they wanted to be enlightened too. And they said, okay, this guy is working really hard and he's liable to become enlightened. So they decided that they would stay with him, and they're hanging around. But when he took food, they thought he'd given up the path, and so they left. And they went to a place called Isipatana. That was the name then. These days it's called Sarnath. It's outside of Varanasi. And it was a deer refuge, and there were a lot of holy men that would go there. And so they went there, and so he decided he would go and follow them there and share his what he had learned with them. And so he got there the first night, and they all kind of turned their back on him, said, no, this guy's given up, and they didn't want to pay him any attention. But then they began to realize he was different. And so finally they listened to him, and he sat down and gave his first talk, which is called the Sutra, Setting the Wheel of Dharma in Motion. And he sat down, and the first thing he said is, I found a middle way. Now remember, he had been raised in luxury. He grew up with the best of everything. And he realized that this life of sensual pleasure, this life of luxury, wasn't going to save him from suffering. And so he had gone and practiced all these ascetic things and had given up everything, tried to really mortify the body. And realized that wasn't the path either. So he had found a middle path. This term middle way is a little confusing. It's not a compromise. It doesn't mean all things in moderation. It's a separate path. It's not the path of sensual pleasure. It's not the path of deprivation. It's something else altogether. So he said, I found this middle path, and he began to explain it. And he said, and the first thing he set out was the Four Noble Truths. So the first noble truth, which is we also refer to as the first seal of the Dharma. When I first started reading about Buddhism, back in the 70s, I guess, all of the academics who translated what had been written would say that the first noble truth of Buddhism is that all life is suffering. Well, that doesn't sound very good. Like, why would anybody want to practice that religion? But that's not what the Buddha actually said. Here's what he said. He said, this, monks, is the noble truth of dukkha. Dukkha is the word that's often translated as suffering, but that's not a real good translation of it. There's not one English word that's a perfect translation for the word dukkha. It includes suffering, stress, despair, kind of existential angst, all kinds of things. Anything that falls under that heading of dissatisfaction, that's dukkha. It says, this, monks, is the noble truth of dukkha. And I'm going to use stress as the translation. Birth is stressful. Aging is stressful. Death is stressful. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are stressful. Association with what is unbeloved is stressful. Separation of what is beloved is stressful. Not getting what one wants is stressful. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. So let me unpack this a little bit. One thing to know is, as we're thinking about this, is that this truth works on 2 levels. We're talking about the cycle of birth and rebirth. When he went out looking for liberation, he was looking for liberation from having to come back again. He recognized that birth was suffering. Birth led to stress, and so on. So, and the way they saw things then was when this life came to an end, there was going to be another one, and he wanted to not come back, because if you come back, there's more suffering. So that's part of it. The other part of it is how we create suffering on a day-to-day level. The last thing he said in all of this is, he said the 5 clinging aggregates is suffering. And that's where these academics that tried to figure this stuff out a long time ago came up with this idea that all life is stressful. The 5 clinging aggregates basically is referring to a me. We think of a me as having a separate, distinct thing, but in Buddhist cosmology, we see me as form, feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and consciousness. It's these 5 heaps of things that come together to create an entity. Okay. So, because these things are inconstant, they're inconstant because they're made up of other things. Because they're inconstant, they're stressful. So there's this cycle of birth and suffering. If you're born, there's going to be suffering. Birth itself is stressful. You're in this nice warm place where everything is taken care of. You don't have to worry about anything. And all of a sudden you're out in a bright, cold room and somebody's whacking you on the ass. That's stressful, right? But then what comes next is also stressful. Old age is stressful. Illness is stressful. And then you die. Now that doesn't mean that it's all bad. He doesn't say everything is suffering. You can have a lot of joy. You can have a lot of pleasure. You can enjoy life. But eventually something's going to become dissatisfying, and then eventually you're going to die. So once there's birth, then there's sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. So this is the first seal of the Dharma. There's a Japanese professor, and I think he's a Shin priest, named Kenneth Tanaka. And I kind of like the way he talks about the first seal of the Dharma. He says, life is a bumpy road. And that's kind of a good way of looking at it. You've got a path to travel, and there's going to be some bumps along the way. Doesn't mean it's all bad. There can be some really pretty scenery, but there's also some bumps. There's also stress and suffering on this kind of second level, which is maybe a little bit less direct, which is where he says, when we get things that we don't want, we have to associate with the unloved. I work with a bunch of guys who are in prison. They don't like being there. That's association with the unbeloved. They have to deal with corrections officers and bad food. That's what that's talking about. And they're also separated from things that they do care about. So separation from the unloved is stressful. There's a point later on where Sariputra, who was one of the Buddha's close companions, talked to a holy man named he was a wanderer, and in this conversation about this wandering ascetic asked him about dukkha, and he said there are 3 kinds of it: the stressfulness of pain, there's the birth, death, and all of that; the stressfulness of fabrication, in other words, what we do with our minds, our mental fabrications, we create suffering; and then the stressfulness of change, which doesn't just have to do with our bodies and the fact that our bodies grow old and decay and eventually fall apart. But circumstances change. You can be in something that seems really good, and then everything ends up different. You buy a car, You know, you've ever bought a brand new car and, oh, I love my shiny new car, and then how do you feel about it 2 years later after it's got some parking lot dings and stuff? It's a little bit less happiness inducing, right? Relationships change. You fall in love with somebody, everything is wonderful, and then, you know, everything is not so wonderful at some point. So you accept that things are inconstant, and you feel a little bit less stressful if you understand that that's going to happen. So the next part of this is what's really was very different, I think, which is the cause of suffering. I don't think it surprised anyone when the Buddha said that birth and death and all that kind of stuff are stressful. But when you get to the next part, that's where it gets interesting. He says the cause is not in the circumstance, but in the mind's involvement in creating suffering. And here's what he said. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the origination of stress, the craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there, that is, craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. So a lot of the times the translation you'll see is the cause of suffering is desire. And you hear that and you think, oh, well, I guess I'm not supposed to want anything. That's not the way it works. It's not desire that's the problem. It's the desire that leads to problems that's the problem. Does that make sense? In other words, some desire leads to suffering and stress and so on. You might think that something's going to be really good, and then when you get it, it's not. And there's somewhere down the road, this gets broken down into what we call the three poisons: greed, anger, and delusion. And greed and anger really are sort of a form of ignorance, but it's kind of helpful to break them down this way. I'm going to segue off track just a little bit because it kind of helps to bring this difference between desire and craving and what this really means into perspective. In the 1950s, there were a couple of guys, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, who started looking at how the mind gets involved in creating disturbance and what thoughts do. And Ellis particularly noticed that there were desires that were preferences, and there were desires that were sort of musts, had to haves. And that these desires that were musts tended to create a lot of upsettedness, right? If you want something and you don't get it, maybe you get disappointed, or maybe you hardly even notice and you move on. If you need something and you don't get it, or you feel like you need something and you don't get it, then it creates problems for you. Then you're liable to get upset or angry or anxious or whatever. So, for example, some of you know that I quit drinking a little over 25 years ago. I still get thoughts once in a while that, gee, a beer would be really good, or, boy, I remember how good cognac was and all of that. It's a little thought that comes up, even a little want. But it doesn't lead to suffering because I don't let it. I don't let it become a craving that then becomes a clinging, that then becomes me being drunk. Okay? That would lead to suffering. And so it's the same way. You have desires for things that don't lead to stress, and that's perfectly okay. If the Buddha didn't want to find a way out of stress, we wouldn't have Buddhism. If you didn't want less stress in your life, you wouldn't be here trying to learn how to meditate, right? And then there's desires for things that, if taken to an extreme, can cause suffering. You might have a glass of wine, it's no big deal. I might have a glass of wine and it turns into a 3-week bender, okay? So it's a matter of what you desire and how you desire it. And so that's when we're looking at this question of desire and craving and stuff, start looking at how your desires lead you toward stress or away from stress. And so that's kind of how this works on a day-to-day level, how you're creating stress for yourself now. But then there's this next part, this bigger thing, which is how desire works on a life-to-life level, if that makes sense. In other words, how does this bring you back so you get born again? Well, there's desires that are basically karmic residues. And I know a lot of you, probably, maybe even most of you, don't think much about reincarnation, don't believe in it. It doesn't make any difference. Same mechanism either way. These mental fabrications tend to cling. And as long as you hang on to a mental fabrication that tends to cling, you're going to keep coming back to the cycle of stress. And so the idea is that when this form comes to an end and passes away, if there's still clinging, then there's going to be becoming. It's going to come back. We're going to talk about that a lot more later on. For right now, just keep in mind that craving is what leads to stress. So, the third noble truth then is if you want to end the suffering, you have to end the cause. And usually when we want to look for an end to a cause for our stress, we look for an external. And he says, no, you have to end your mind's involvement in it. He says, this, monks, is the noble truth of the cessation of stress. The remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. So in other words, stop wanting stuff that creates suffering. That seems simple, and it is simple, but it's not easy. And he doesn't just leave us there. That would be like saying, how many of you gained weight over the holidays? Right? I did. Now I could say, well, stop wanting to eat things that make you fat and stop wanting not to exercise, and everything will be okay. And that's kind of sort of true, but that's just a start. You have to take a path that's going to burn off more calories than you're taking in, right? If you want to be physically well, there are certain things that you have to do in order to do that. If you want to be spiritually well, there are certain things that you have to do in order to do that as well. And so this takes us to the fourth noble truth, which is the path to cessation. So he doesn't just say, that's it, problem solved. He says, here's how you do this. This, monks, is the noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress. Precisely this noble eightfold path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So that's the middle way. It's not sensual desire. It's not total renunciation of sensual desire. It's not a compromise. It's doing the right things that lead to the end of craving, to the end of stress. So to end suffering, you have to, basically, you can break this into three things. And we're going to spend the next few weeks really analyzing the path. But to sort of set the stage for that, the path breaks down into cultivating wisdom, seeing reality as it is, seeing the cause of suffering as the cause of suffering, knowing when you're suffering and knowing what's causing it. And then developing the thoughts, the intentions that will move you away from that. Behaving with compassion, behaving with non-harming toward yourself and others. And then finally, training your mind to let go of the patterns that keep bringing you back to stress and to cultivate states of mind that lead you toward happiness.